through his Twitter that he doesn't actually run.
He almost broke Mr. Anderson's nose.
Virgil once stood on WWE TV right beside the $1 Million Man, dressed sharp and known by millions of fans. But his final years showed how a wrestling name could hit rock bottom. He spent decades as the bodyguard and helper to Ted DiBiase, a role that put his face in front of huge TV crowds. That fame never turned into lasting money. In 2022, Virgil suffered 2 major strokes. Doctors also found stage 2 colon cancer. His memory began to fade with dementia. People who once cheered for him were now asked to send donations just so he could buy food, clothing, and basic toiletries. In February 2024, Virgil died at age 61. His own family had to start a fundraiser just to pay for his funeral and burial. A man who once played a wealthy character on national television could not afford to be buried without help from strangers. And if stories like this deserve more attention, use the hype feature and give this video a hype as we look at how it became possible for so many former stars to end up this way. Virgil is not one strange exception. He is part of a much bigger and sadder pattern inside professional wrestling. A pattern that stretches across decades and touches performers from very different eras of the business. Some of the wrestlers in that pattern have already passed away after years of hardship. Others are still alive today, still facing serious financial and medical struggles right now. This video will be honest about which is which as we go, because both kinds of stories matter, and neither one should be dismissed as simple bad luck or poor personal choices. So here's the real question this video wants to answer. How could people who once appeared on huge TV shows, who helped build a massive wrestling business worth billions of dollars, finish their lives without enough money for basic needs like food, housing, or medical care? How does someone go from performing in front of sold-out arenas to asking strangers on the internet for help buying groceries, paying rent, or affording basic medical care? To understand that, we need to look past any one wrestler and look at the whole system they worked inside. A system that shaped every single story in this video long before any individual mistake or misfortune ever entered the picture. Professional wrestling grew into a business worth billions of dollars. WWE became a giant global company, earning huge money from TV deals, live events around the world, and merchandise sales. Yet many of the performers who helped build that empire were never treated like normal employees. Instead, most wrestlers were classified as independent contractors. That single label changed almost everything about their financial future. When a company hires someone as a regular employee, that company usually pays for health insurance, sets aside money for retirement, and follows strict labor rules. An independent contractor gets almost none of that. Instead, the wrestler is expected to handle these costs alone. Wrestlers historically had to buy their own health insurance, plan their own taxes, and save for their own retirement without any company support. On top of that, many performers paid for their own hotels, rental cars, and travel between shows. In most traditional sports organizations, the team covers flights, hotels, and ground transportation as a normal part of doing business. Wrestling historically worked very differently, with performers absorbing those costs out of their own pockets, night after night, city after city. During the busiest years of their careers, some wrestlers were on the road for 200 to 300 days out of the year. Imagine spending most of your year away from home, paying your own bills for hotels and cars, all while doing a job that puts constant stress on your body and leaves very little time to rest or recover between shows. There was no standard pension waiting for these performers when they retired. In many major sports leagues, players who retire can count on a pension check, built up over years through a union agreement. Wrestling never had that same kind of union power. There was no players' association standing between the wrestlers and the company, negotiating for guaranteed benefits like health coverage or retirement savings. In a typical employer relationship, a company might automatically provide health insurance and set aside retirement contributions on a worker's behalf. Wrestling's independent contractor model removed that automatic support entirely, placing the full weight of those decisions on each individual performer. Without a union, individual performers had almost no leverage to demand better long-term protection, no matter how much money their matches brought in for the company. If a wrestler suffered an injury while under contract, the company did often cover that injury and the immediate treatment needed to heal. That part of the system worked reasonably well for wrestlers who were still actively performing. But that protection could end the moment a contract was not renewed. Once a wrestler left the company, whether by choice, by injury, or simply because they were let go, they lost access to that medical coverage completely and immediately. There was no ongoing plan for surgeries, chronic pain treatment, or long-term care after the cameras stopped rolling and the contract ended. A hip that needed replacing, a spine that needed ongoing treatment, or a brain that needed monitoring after years of impact became the performer's own financial responsibility the moment they stopped being an active talent on the roster. In 2006, after public concern grew following the death of wrestler Eddie Guerrero in 2005, the company created a talent wellness program. This program added drug testing, heart screening, and brain testing, along with fully funded rehabilitation for substance abuse. That kind of help mattered for some performers struggling with addiction, and it likely prevented additional tragedies among wrestlers who were still under contract. But critics have pointed out that this program never grew into full medical coverage for retired wrestlers. It did not pay for orthopedic surgery, ongoing pain management, or general health care once someone left the roster. A congressional investigation in 2008 into drug policy across professional sports even suggested that public image concerns played a real part in why this rehabilitation program expanded the way it did, rather than any formal legal requirement forcing the company to act. That distinction matters because it suggests the protection wrestlers did receive came more from public pressure than from any guaranteed right built into how the business operated. So even with that improvement, older and retired stars were often left to handle serious medical needs completely on their own, long after the public attention around wellness programs had faded. This is the system that shaped what happened next to performers like Perry Saturn. Perry Saturn spent years as a respected performer across some of wrestling's biggest promotions, including ECW, WCW, and WWE. Inside the ring, he was known for real skill and physical toughness, the kind of wrestler other performers respected for his ability and his work ethic. Outside the ring in 2004, his life changed forever in a single violent moment. Saturn stepped in to protect someone during an attempted sexual assault. While defending that person, he was shot twice. The damage to his body was severe. The bullets caused injury to his C5, C6, and C7 vertebrae in his neck, and he also lost his collarbone in the attack. His medical problems did not only change his body, they also ended the work that paid his bills. Doctors performed emergency spinal surgery, placing a steel plate and stainless steel screws into his neck just to stabilize his spine. That kind of injury brings intense, ongoing pain. The sort of pain that does not simply disappear after surgery, and the kind of pain that can follow someone every single day for the rest of their life. To manage that pain, Saturn was prescribed medication. Prescription pain relief can help in the short term, but for many people it can also lead toward dependence, especially when the underlying injury never fully heals. Over time, Saturn's struggle with pain medication grew into a deeper addiction, and later that addiction included methamphetamine as well. This is not a story about someone choosing an easy or reckless life. It is a story about a serious workplace injury suffered while protecting another person, followed by addiction that grew out of unmanaged pain. Inside a system with no long-term medical safety net waiting to help him once his career came to an end. Saturn eventually disappeared from public view completely for nearly a decade. Fans who remembered him from his best years in the ring had no idea where he had gone or what had happened to him. During that stretch of his life, he experienced more than 2.5 years of homelessness, without shelter, without stability, and without the income he once earned from wrestling. When he resurfaced years later, the picture of his health was troubling. He was described as living with a traumatic brain injury, along with dementia-like symptoms connected in the research to repeated blows to the head from his wrestling career. Years of high-impact moves, falls, and physical trauma can damage memory and judgment over time. And that kind of damage makes it far harder to hold down steady work or manage money responsibly. It also makes everyday tasks, the kind most people never think twice about, much harder to manage alone. With no job, rising medical costs, and no company safety net remaining, Saturn's survival came to depend entirely on public support. Fans organized GoFundMe campaigns just to help him access safe housing and get proper medical testing, the same kind of testing that in a different industry might have been covered automatically as part of a retirement medical plan. Instead, his access to basic diagnostic care depended on whether enough strangers online decided to contribute. Saturn was not alone in trying to hold the wrestling business accountable for these long-term injuries. He joined other performers including Road Warrior Animal and Big Russ McCullough in lawsuits related to head trauma and concussions suffered during their careers, adding his name to a group of former wrestlers who had all suffered similar long-term damage. These lawsuits argued that the company failed to properly warn wrestlers about the long-term dangers tied to repeated blows to the head. In the end, those lawsuits were dismissed, defeated in part through legal arguments involving time limits on when a lawsuit could be filed, and through the same independent contractor status that had shaped his entire career and left him without benefits in the first place. A man who was shot while protecting someone else, who lost his health and his home, could not even win a legal case meant to hold the industry responsible for the toll his job had taken on his brain and body. His story shows just how far someone can fall when courage, physical trauma, and a missing safety net collide with almost no warning, and how little legal ground a performer is left standing on once that collision happens. From one of wrestling's most painful personal collapses, we move to a performer who filled arenas but still struggled to hold on to what he earned. James Harris, known to fans around the world as Kamala. James Harris performed under the name Kamala, and during the 1980s and 1990s, he was one of wrestling's most recognizable attractions. He shared the ring in major programs against legends like Hulk Hogan and The Undertaker, drawing huge crowds to arenas across the country, night after night, in cities all over the map. According to the research, his matches helped bring in very large ticket sales for those events, the kind of gate revenue that most performers never see reflected in their own paycheck. Yet the money Harris actually earned from those big nights did not always reflect how much revenue he helped generate. Severe pay differences meant that despite drawing major crowds, Harris often received far less than what his drawing power might have suggested. That gap between what a performer generates for a company and what that performer actually takes home is one of the clearest examples of how the wrestling business could reward everyone except the person doing the physical work in the ring. It also reflects an era of wrestling history when payoffs varied widely from territory to territory, with far less transparency than fans might assume from the outside, and with performers rarely having any real ability to question or negotiate what they were paid. To save money while traveling for work, Harris has described sleeping inside rental cars, cutting his own comfort short so he could send more of his limited earnings home to support his family. Think about that image for a moment. A man who was drawing sold-out crowds against some of the biggest stars in wrestling history was, at the same time, sleeping in a parked car just to stretch his paycheck a little further. As Harris grew older, his health took a serious turn. He developed type 2 diabetes along with high blood pressure, two conditions that can lead to devastating complications if not carefully managed over many years. For Harris, those complications became reality. In 2011 and again in 2012, he underwent amputations below the knee. His kidneys eventually reached end-stage failure, requiring dialysis treatment 3 times every single week just to stay alive. These are not quick or simple medical needs. They require constant care, regular appointments, specialized equipment, and significant ongoing expense that continues for the rest of a person's life with no end date and no way to plan around it. And no employer plan waiting to help absorb the cost. With his working years long behind him, Harris relied on small federal disability payments to get by. To bring in a bit of extra income, he sold hand-carved wooden chairs that he made himself, turning a personal skill into whatever supplemental income he could manage. Even with these efforts, Harris fell into serious financial trouble. By 2019, his property taxes had gone unpaid for too long, and his home faced the very real threat of county foreclosure. Fellow wrestlers stepped in to help bring attention to his situation, using their own platforms and connections to raise donations that could cover the overdue taxes and protect his home from being taken away. It says something meaningful that it took other performers, people who understood exactly what he had given to the business, to organize that support rather than any structure built into the industry itself. Sadly, Harris died from complications related to COVID-19 in 2020. A man who once helped fill massive arenas against some of wrestling's biggest stars spent his final years worrying about dialysis, missing limbs, and whether he would lose the roof over his head. His story is not about failure on his part. It is about a system where drawing enormous crowds and generating enormous revenue never guaranteed lasting financial security once the matches ended and the arenas emptied out for good. That painful gap between fame and financial safety brings us back to where this video began. To Virgil, whose entire television character was built around wealth, even though his own real-life finances told a very different story. Michael Jones became known to wrestling fans everywhere simply as Virgil. His most famous role placed him beside the Million Dollar Man, Ted DiBiase, a character built entirely around flaunting wealth and power. Virgil's job was to stand at his side, visible on national television during one of wrestling's most widely watched eras, appearing week after week in front of huge audiences who knew his face instantly. That level of visibility, however, never translated into the kind of financial security his television character seemed to represent. The irony sits at the center of his entire story. He spent years playing a servant to an outrageously wealthy character, while his own real bank account looked nothing like the image on screen. After leaving the major wrestling promotions of his prime, Jones spent many years earning a living through the fan convention circuit. He traveled from event to event, selling autographs, and meeting fans, a career path that many retired wrestlers relied on once their in-ring days were over, since it offered a way to keep earning without needing a completely new set of job skills. Over time, though, his financial situation grew more and more unstable, with fewer guarantees and less income each year as opportunities for appearances became harder to find, and his health made travel more difficult. By 2022, serious health problems began stacking up. Jones suffered 2 major strokes that year, the kind of medical emergency that can permanently change a person's ability to live independently. Doctors also diagnosed him with stage 2 colon cancer, adding another serious and expensive diagnosis to an already difficult year. Alongside these physical struggles, he was living with advanced dementia, a condition that can make even basic daily decisions difficult, from managing money to remembering appointments to simply keeping track of medication. According to the research, Jones lacked private health insurance, had no pension to fall back on, and had no significant savings set aside to help absorb the cost of any of these conditions. Public fundraising pages were created simply to help cover his most basic needs, including food, clothing, and toiletries. Think about that contrast for a moment. A man once famous for playing a bodyguard to a supposedly wealthy character needed public donations just to buy toiletries in his final years, the smallest and most basic items a person needs just to get through each day. In February 2024, Jones passed away at age 61. Even after his death, the financial strain on his family did not end. They had to start their own GoFundMe campaign just to pay for his funeral and burial costs. One final reminder that no safety net had ever been built to catch him, not even at the very end. Being famous, appearing weekly on national television, and helping build one of the biggest media brands in the world did not guarantee Jones a comfortable retirement or even a fully funded funeral. Fame is not the same thing as ownership, savings, or lasting financial protection, and Virgil's story makes that painfully clear from beginning to end. We do not need to explain again what independent contractor status meant for wrestlers of his era. His story simply shows how completely that missing safety net could fail someone, even someone the whole country once recognized on sight. Not every difficult story from wrestling's past belongs to a former WWE roster star. Lawrence Shreve, known to wrestling fans as Abdullah the Butcher, built his reputation across international wrestling territories from the 1960s all the way through the 2000s. He earned a place in the Hall of Fame as one of hardcore wrestling's most respected legends, known for a physical and punishing style that drew crowds across many different countries over the course of his long career. His career spanned decades and multiple countries, far beyond any single company, which meant he never fell under the specific benefit programs or wellness policies tied to one promotion. As Shreve reached his 80s, his body began to fail him in serious ways. Decades of physical wear finally caught up with him. He developed severe hip problems that took away much of his mobility, leaving him dependent on a fixed and limited income during a stage of life when medical costs tend to rise sharply and daily needs become harder to manage without help. According to the research, Shreve also became a target of alleged identity theft and alleged asset stripping. These are serious accusations, and it is important to remember the word alleged, since these matters became tied up in civil and marital legal disputes rather than a proven criminal case. As those disputes unfolded, Shreve was hit with a dispossessory notice, a legal document that placed him at real risk of eviction from his own home. A wrestling legend who had spent decades entertaining fans across the globe found himself in his 80s facing the possibility of losing his home through legal and financial pressures largely outside his direct control, at a point in life when he had far less ability to fight back or start over. Public fundraising efforts were organized to try to help him hold on to some stability. once again, relying on fans and fellow performers rather than any built-in industry protection. His situation is a reminder that age, disability, and a limited income can leave older performers dangerously exposed to fraud and legal pressure, especially once they no longer have the platform, the physical strength, or the financial resources to defend themselves easily. A career that spanned decades and crossed borders around the world still left him without the kind of stability that should have come with that level of contribution to the business. Performing across so many different territories and countries also meant he never spent his career under one single company's wellness program or any consistent set of protections. Since the international independent scene he built his legend in never had anything close to a unified benefit system in the first place. Brian Jędrzejewicz, known to fans as Brian Knobbs of the Nasty Boys, built his career as a tag team champion from the 1980s through the 2010s, earning a loyal following through a long and physical run in the ring alongside his tag team partner. Winning championship gold meant real popularity during his active years, the kind of recognition that could carry a performer's name for decades after his last match. Like so many performers of his era, much of his post-wrestling income depended on staying active on the convention and appearance circuit, traveling to meet fans, sign autographs, and relive matches from his career. That kind of appearance income can feel steady for years, but it depended entirely on one single thing: his physical ability to keep traveling from city to city. When Knobbs experienced a severe gastrointestinal medical emergency, followed by a knee that completely gave out and required a total knee replacement, his ability to travel vanished almost overnight. There was no gradual transition and no warning period to plan ahead. Without travel, the appearance bookings that had supported him for years disappeared just as quickly, taking his main source of income along with them. A GoFundMe campaign was organized to help cover his hospital bills and basic household needs while he recovered from surgery and tried to rebuild some stability. His story shows something important about how fragile this kind of income really is for performers who never had a corporate paycheck or benefits behind them. When a performer's body can no longer make the trip to the next convention or signing event, the money that used to follow him can disappear just as fast, sometimes within weeks, leaving almost no time to prepare for the gap. Look at these 5 stories side by side for a moment. A man shot while protecting a stranger, a main event attraction who slept in rental cars to support his family, a TV star who needed donations just to buy toiletries, a Hall of Fame legend threatened with eviction in his 80s, a tag team champion who lost his income the moment his knee gave out. 5 completely different performers, 5 completely different paths into the business. And yet, every single one of them ended up leaning on public donations just to get through basic parts of life that most working people take for granted. That is not a coincidence, it is a pattern. And patterns point toward causes bigger than any one person's choices. When 5 very different careers across different decades and different companies all end up funneling into the same place, the honest question is not what each of these men did wrong. The honest question is what the business itself failed to provide. These individual stories are painful on their own, but taken together, they reveal a repeating pattern that shows up again and again throughout professional wrestling history. It usually starts the same way. Wrestlers spend years performing through real physical pain, often afraid that resting or admitting an injury could cost them their spot on the roster or their next booking. In a business built on constant competition for spots and storylines, showing weakness could feel like a direct threat to a performer's livelihood. To keep working despite that pain, many turn to medication just to get through another night in the ring or another long drive to the next town on the schedule. Over the years, some performers relied on prescription pain relievers, muscle relaxants, and other substances meant to help their bodies keep up with the physical demands of the job and the look the business expected from its stars. None of that started as reckless behavior. It started as a way to survive a schedule and a physical standard that left very little room for rest. Meanwhile, the physical toll of the job keeps building quietly in the background. Repeated hits, falls, and impacts accumulate over years. Even when no single injury feels dramatic enough on its own to end a career, it is rarely one big moment that causes the collapse. It is usually hundreds of smaller ones stacked on top of each other, night after night, city after city. Eventually, though, the damage adds up and careers come to an end. Sometimes suddenly through one serious injury, and sometimes gradually as a body simply wears down past the point of being able to perform. Medical costs, however, do not end along with the career. Bills for surgery, physical therapy, and ongoing pain management continue arriving long after the paychecks stop and long after any public attention has moved on to newer stars. As income falls and medical needs rise, some performers begin to experience real decline in memory, judgment, or basic mobility, tied to the years of physical trauma their bodies absorbed during their active years. This kind of decline makes it even harder to manage money wisely or make sound decisions during an already difficult stretch of life, at exactly the moment when careful decisions matter the most. Personal savings, if any exist, tend to disappear quickly under the weight of these mounting medical and living expenses. Once those savings run out, public donations often become the very last safety net standing between a former wrestler and complete financial collapse. A safety net that depends entirely on public attention rather than any guaranteed right. Chronic pain, damaged joints, and repeated blows to the head all play a role in this pattern. So does the difficulty of managing money clearly while facing cognitive decline, which can leave people more vulnerable to addiction, to fraud, and to identity theft, much like what Lawrence Shreve experienced in his own later years. Across many of these cases, GoFundMe has effectively become a substitute pension system, something former performers and their families lean on for scans, surgeries, groceries, transportation, housing costs, unpaid taxes, and even funeral expenses. Think about how many completely different needs that one fundraising platform has quietly been asked to cover. Needs that in almost any other major industry would be handled through structured benefits instead of public charity. Survival. In far too many of these stories depends on whether the public happens to notice a fundraiser and decides to help, rather than on any guaranteed benefit that these performers actually earned through years of physically demanding work. A well-known name might get lucky and draw enough attention to cover a surgery. A less recognizable performer, with the exact same injuries and the exact same needs, might get almost no help at all. It is important to say clearly that not every wrestler follows this exact same path. Not every performer ends up in crisis. But the research identifies this sequence as a pattern that repeats often enough across very different performers, different eras, and different promotions to reveal something structural, rather than something that can be blamed on any one person's individual choices or spending habits. It helps to compare wrestling's setup with two of America's other major professional sports leagues, the NFL and the NBA. Players in both of those leagues belong to strong labor unions, giving them collective bargaining power that wrestlers have never had. That single difference in structure shapes almost everything else that follows for a retired athlete in each of these industries. Because of those unions, NFL and NBA players have access to real pension systems once their careers end, systems built up over years through negotiated agreements rather than left to chance. They also benefit from structured post-career medical support that continues well past their final game. The NFL, for example, created a large concussion settlement fund, along with a disability trust, specifically to help former players dealing with long-term brain injuries. A direct response to growing evidence about how dangerous repeated head trauma can be over a career. The NBA offers a retired players' healthcare trust, giving many veterans access to health coverage that continues well after their playing days are finished, covering ongoing needs rather than stopping the moment a player leaves the roster. It is worth pointing out that this problem is not only something from wrestling's past. The research shows that this kind of financial risk continues today, even for performers earning far more money than the stars of earlier decades. Modern main roster performers on major televised shows can earn base salaries averaging over $500,000 a year, a number that sounds like total security on paper. Even so, their contracts can still expose them to sudden financial trouble. A demotion in the storyline or a release from the company following an injury can cause a performer's income to drop by more than half almost overnight, while their fixed expenses, medical needs, and travel costs stay just as high as before. On the independent wrestling circuit away from the biggest companies, many performers work entirely without health insurance, and some have turned to public fundraising just to pay for basic diagnostic scans, including spinal imaging that can cost around $5,000 after a single in-ring injury. So while the biggest names today may earn more than performers did decades ago, the underlying structure that created so much hardship for earlier generations has not disappeared. It has simply followed the business into its modern era, wearing a bigger paycheck on the surface while leaving many of the same gaps underneath. Major wrestling performers, by contrast, remain classified as independent contractors, even though promotions often control nearly every part of a performer's schedule, storylines, ring gear, and public image. the same level of control an employer would typically have over a full-time employee. According to the research, there is no equivalent wrestling pension system and no broad medical trust set up for retired performers, leaving a wide and very real gap compared to what athletes in other major American sports leagues can count on. The research behind this video points towards several possible solutions to help close that gap. One idea involves revisiting how wrestlers are classified under labor law, since the level of control promotions hold over performers looks very different from how a typical independent contractor operates in most other industries. If that classification changed, it could open the door to employer-sponsored health insurance, workers' compensation, and unemployment protections that most wrestlers have never had access to. Another proposal calls for a legacy medical trust, funded by the wrestling promotions themselves out of their media rights revenue, designed specifically to help cover the cost of joint replacements, reconstructive surgery, and long-term brain care for aging performers. Emergency housing support could help prevent situations like the eviction risk faced by Lawrence Shreve, giving performers facing foreclosure or eviction somewhere to turn besides a public fundraiser. Financial education and tax planning support could also help performers avoid the kind of sudden insolvency described throughout these stories, giving them practical tools to manage money during their active years, so a sudden injury or contract non-renewal does not immediately turn into a full-blown financial crisis for them and their families. Career transition assistance could help wrestlers prepare for steady work once their time in the ring comes to an end, since a career built around physical performance rarely lasts as long as a typical working life. It is important to be clear that these ideas remain recommendations drawn from the research. They are not policies currently in place across the wrestling industry today, and there is no guarantee that any of them will be adopted in the future without real pressure for change. Without some kind of legal or corporate shift, the same basic pipeline could keep repeating for the next generation of performers, turning young, physically gifted athletes into older adults facing serious illness, limited income, and no dependable safety net. The exact same ending we have seen play out again and again in this video. These wrestlers gave their bodies, their health, and countless years of their lives to entertain millions of fans around the world. They stepped into the ring night after night, absorbing real physical damage so audiences could watch something unforgettable, filling arenas and driving a business worth billions of dollars in the process. That contribution deserves genuine respect and gratitude, not judgment, and it deserves to be remembered clearly, alongside the difficulties that so often followed once the cameras stopped rolling. At the same time, the system surrounding their careers too often left them without the basic protections that would have let them face illness, injury, and old age with real dignity. No performer should have to wonder, after decades of work, whether a fundraiser will raise enough money in time to cover a surgery, save a home, or pay for a funeral. A performer's final chapter should never depend on whether fans happen to notice a post online and decide to help. These wrestlers earned more than applause during their best years, more than a night of cheering fans and a highlight reel that gets replayed for years afterward. They earned the kind of lasting support that should have carried them safely through the years that followed the spotlight fading away, so that the price of entertaining so many people for so long would never have to be paid with their own health, their own homes, or their own peace of mind, no matter how far the spotlight had already moved on to somebody else.